Jonathan from Hartford Baptist Church, and welcome to episode, I think we're on 17 now. I'd probably say the wrong episode again. I believe we're episode 17. I'll realize it when I upload it. But we're still in Galatians chapter 5. We are finishing up the book. We're going to be starting in verse 7 today, and hopefully you've been watching along with us, and because we've covered so much, I really can't recap now. Otherwise, we'd spend now 45 minutes just to recap everything. But Paul had just recently got out of, laying down the law, so to speak. I shouldn't use that because Paul's saying we don't lay down the law, we lay down the faith. But if you accept circumcision, if you accept the things of the Old Testament, you put yourself back under it, you depend on that for your salvation and not faith in Jesus, then Jesus is worthless to you. You can't be faith in Jesus plus Old Testament works, Old Testament law. You can't be both. It is faith alone is the argument that Paul is making, and that's the main storyline of this book, so to speak. But starting in verse 7, Paul says, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" I'm going to stop right there. We're doing a little bit different than normal. Verse 7, "You were running well. Who hindered you from obeying the truth?" This is looking back at the Roman games, the track meet. And it's just their track meets, if you want to call them that, were just like ours. If you got in somebody else, there was rules prohibiting you getting in someone else's lane, blocking them, or tripping them up. Paul, in the language Paul is here, is saying someone's cheating you. Someone is hindering you. They're either tripping you or they're in your lane. They are cheating you. This persuasion is not from him who calls you, and that him being God. A little leaven leavens the whole lump. And this is a reference to bread, and it's a reference to yeast in the dough. The yeast is the leaven, and if you get just a little bit of yeast in bread, in that unrised dough, the whole thing's going to rise. Yeast just spreads everywhere. Yeast gets in the air. You don't even have to put yeast in bread per se. It can just be floating around in the air and get in the bread and cause it to rise. That's why in the Old Testament, when they would celebrate the feast of unleavened bread, they would have to remove every bit of yeast from the house. Couldn't even have it in the house. It would ruin your bread. And this is a proverbial saying. This isn't original to Paul. It was a proverbial saying of his time that, and its reference was usually something corrupting, something evil will spoil everything, and you just need a little bit. And of course, what's this little bit here Paul's referring to is works of the law. He's saying if you just, even if you're 95% of your doctrine is right, but you allow this 5% in that's wrong, it's going to spoil everything. To add even one work of circumcision to salvation spoils the whole thing. It ruins it, even if you just add something. And likewise, we talked about baptism recently, how baptism can become a work attached to salvation, much like circumcision was in the Church of Galatia. If we allow baptism, as good as it is and as symbolic it is and how it is commanded by God as well, but if we make it a requirement of salvation, that little bit of leaven, that little bit of that doctrine being off in salvation, which is obviously the central doctrine of Christianity, pretty much, other maybe the doctrine of Christ, if we allow that in there, it's going to ruin everything. So your doctrine of salvation must be according to Scripture. If you change that salvation is powerless. Or the crosswork of Christ is powerless for salvation. Then Paul goes on, verse 10, "I have confidence in the Lord that you will take no other view, and the one who is troubling you will bear the penalty, whoever he is." Paul probably knows whoever he is. He just doesn't want to mention his name. Maybe it's like Voldemort, the name that shall not be mentioned. But Paul doesn't say who it is. But he's probably got an idea who. But just doesn't mention their name. But he has confidence in the congregation that they will hold on to the faith that they've been taught. But they will not accept this new view, and they will hold on to what Paul has taught them. And then verse 11 is interesting. "But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed." So verse 11 really implies that this teacher or teachers who have infiltrated have said, hey, Paul preaches circumcision. Paul's okay with this. Because otherwise, why would Paul say this? But if I, brothers, still preaching circumcision, why am I being persecuted? Like, why are they upset with me if I'm teaching the same thing they're teaching? Paul's not teaching this. One, they're either flat out lying, saying Paul said something he didn't say, or they've misunderstood Paul's actions. Perhaps it was the whole event of Titus being brought before the church, and they decided Titus didn't need to be circumcised. Um, or perhaps if Galatians was written later than I think it is, maybe it's talking about the situation with Timothy, because Timothy was later circumcised, but Timothy wasn't circumcised out of a need for salvation. Timothy was circumcised purely on tradition. And that's okay. It's okay today to have your child, your son, circumcised out of tradition. It's okay to have your son circumcised on a perceived health benefit. Those are okay. Timothy was circumcised. It was okay. But if we make circumcision about salvation, that's not okay. And that's what Paul's argument against circumcision was. The last half of 11, in that case, the offense of the cross has been removed. This can mean a couple things, but I think what Paul's referring to is, if I was truly preaching circumcision, if I'm preaching salvation by the law, the offense of the cross, that scandal on the cross, has been removed, and we say the gospel of Jesus has been removed, because that's what he was preaching. He preaches Christ crucified. He says that at the beginning of the book. We preach Christ crucified, and if he's not doing that, if he's preaching circumcision, if he's preaching law, there's no need to preach Christ crucified. And actually, that came out of 1 Corinthians. That wasn't the beginning of this book. But at 1 Corinthians, he says that we preach Christ crucified. So I think what he's saying there is, if I'm preaching circumcision, if I'm preaching keeping the law as a central doctrine of faith, then there's no reason for me to preach the offense of the cross. It's been abolished. It's no longer needed. It's worthless. Verse 12, this is one that causes people pain, a couple reasons. Boys usually squeeze their legs together. And commentators try to make Paul sound nicer than he was. But another commentator by the name of Ramsey, he accuses Paul of of basically cussing, using graphic, disgusting language. Because Paul does say, as the NET, I think, reflects a little bit better, I wish those agitators would go so far as to castrate themselves. It is the most graphic language Paul uses in the Bible, and Paul is being rough, but there's a little sarcasm here. He's not being hateful. He's not being mean. The Judaizers are those who believe the law has a place in salvation, and so this comment, Paul either meant it one of two ways, and either way they would have understood what Paul was saying, and they probably maybe understood it both ways. One, if you were to castrate yourself, you cut your balls off. Secularly, you are no longer a true man. You are less than a man. So if Paul is meaning it in this sense, in the secular sense, he's saying they might as well cut their balls off because they're not real men anyways. And what's probably more probable, Paul means it in the religious Old Testament sense, because that's where these guys are coming from. If you are castrated, you're also called a eunuch, and a eunuch is not allowed in the ecclesia of the Lord, the church, the congregation of the Lord. They are banned, because this was not an approved practice. You were not to mutilate your body this way. So Paul is basically saying, no, just go ahead and completely castrate yourself, and that way we don't have to worry about you, because you won't be allowed in the church because you believe those Old Testament laws are still applicable. So either way, they would have took it that way. There was a direct shot at him, a little bit of sarcasm, irony. Paul's probably trying to be funny, not trying to be hateful, but the language is graphic, and it throws some people for a loop there. And we're going to end there. No, we're not. We're going to go back to verse 9. This will be kind of our daily thought here. That little leaven, leavens the whole lump. Or as the net does in the middle, a little yeast makes the whole batch of dough rise. I want to apply this verse to our life. Think about it today, and what leaven do you have in your life? This doesn't have to be a false doctrine. This could be something. This could be a sin, something little. Maybe 99% of your life is living in accordance of Scripture, and you're living it for Christ. You're following Him the best you can, but you've got that one thing. You've got that little bit of yeast in your life. Paul's saying that yeast is going to ruin the whole lump. That little sin can grow out of control. Now, maybe it's a conversation you're having with someone who's not your spouse or not your boyfriend or girlfriend, and you shouldn't be having it with them, and all of a sudden it turns into something big and out of control, and it does turn into sin. What is that yeast in your life that can ruin the whole lump? Are we, I won't speculate what it may be, but just evaluate your life. Do you got yeast in your life that you need to remove from the house, so to speak? Anyways, we'll end there, and I will see you next time.